This channel is part of the History Hit network.
This is Edgehill, the imposing ridge that rises abruptly from the flat plain of the county of Warwickshire in England. It was from these slopes in October 1642 that the forces of King Charles I descended to fight the parliamentarian army of the Earl of Essex, bringing a shattering end to more than 130 years of peace. Neither side was able to claim outright victory at the end of the bloody battle that followed, but for the Royalist side, the battle represented a lost opportunity to inflict a crushing early defeat on their foe. Foreshadowing events to come, the ill-disciplined Royalist cavalry absented itself from the field of Edgehill at a crucial stage of the battle, and by the time they returned, they were too late to influence its outcome. The king lived not only to regret the cavalry's mistake, but to see it repeated later in the war. King Charles had argued with his parliaments almost from the first day of his reign. As year followed year and the position of both sides became more and more entrenched, the prospect of a peaceful solution to the nation's problems became increasingly remote. By early 1642, Charles was faced with the outright hostility of the Commons and the people of London, and was forced to flee to York in the north of England.
This means that London is conceded. The king gives up London to Parliament. It means that the forces of order in London, the trained bands, become the nucleus of a separate parliamentary army.
History records that King Charles was a man of great principle and firm convictions, but he was a man totally opposed to the kind of change that large sections of his people demanded. Charles was only the second king to sit on the combined throne of Scotland and England, which, although they shared a monarch, were still separate countries in every legal and economic sense. Although he was born in Scotland and spoke with a trace of the Scots accent that he'd inherited from his father, Charles largely turned his back on that country. His slight speech impediment meant that he lacked a certain presence, but this was compensated by his earnest religious faith and the serious manner in which he accepted the burden of kingship. The king was studious, dedicated, and absolutely resolute in any cause in which he firmly believed. He was particularly staunch in his desire to uphold the ancient laws and structures of England, but as he interpreted them. King Charles once famously outlined his own inflexible views on the role of the monarch.
I alone must answer to God for our exercise of the authority He has vested in me. It is for me to decide how our nation is to be governed, how my subjects are to be ruled, and above all, how the church shall be established under the rule of law. These are the divine rights of kings, and are ordained by the Almighty. It is not the place of the subject to question the royal prerogative. I shall endeavour to uphold the liberties of the country, but my authority is absolute and may not be questioned.
History Hit is like Netflix just for history fans, with exclusive history documentaries covering some of the most famous people and events in history, just for you. Whether you're looking to dive into life and crime in Victorian London, or the forgotten history that deserves to be heard, History Hit has a documentary for you, just a click away. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you can't find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Absolute History fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code AbsoluteHistory at checkout.
On St. George's Day, 1642, the king tried to seize arms and ammunition stored at nearby Hull, but was denied entry to the town by Sir John Hotham. Although he was desperately short of weapons, Charles spent the next 4 months gathering the beginnings of an army until, in August 1642, he felt in a strong enough position to raise his standard at Nottingham. At last, the genteel pretences were cast aside. The English Civil War had begun in earnest.
The king was raising his forces in the border areas around Shrewsbury, which was his initial base. He had moved from York through the Midland Shires, gaining men as he moved, but the majority, particularly of his infantry, was recruited from the border areas. He moved from Shrewsbury, once he had an army in play, moving towards London. He wanted to bring on an engagement. In a sense, both sides wanted to bring on an engagement because there was a hope that that would determine the entire war. That would be it.
London was the critical target. If Charles could capture London before the war really developed momentum and the enemy were able to mobilise their forces properly, then the war would be over.
For the parliamentary side, it was vital that the king's forces should be prevented from reaching London. The man entrusted with this task was 51-year-old Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex.
The Earl of Essex was undoubtedly an extremely brave man. I mean, it's notorious that he took his coffin along on this campaign, as much as to say, lads, it's death or glory. And he was something that is very common in English military history, or rather British military history. He's a very good regimental commander. But above that, he begins to lose it very quickly. Formations under his command quickly lose coherence. It's notorious that he was very bad on the big picture.
The stolidity that made him admirable in many respects affects his generalship. At Edgehill, he refuses to make an attacking move because I think he believed that he wanted to show that it was the king who was the aggressor. But that kind of reluctance to make major moves, or only to move in force with the fullness of all his resources, means that his army lumbers from area to area.
In an attempt to cut off the king's route to London, Essex marched his men from Worcester to Warwick, and by October the 22nd, it lay near Kyneton, a village to the south of the town. The Royalists had marched down from Shrewsbury via Wolverhampton and, true to form where Essex was concerned, they had managed to get themselves between the parliamentarians and the capital.
Edgehill, Kyneton, that part of the world, lies at a crossroads between the great southeast to northwest road and the great southwest to northeast road in England at the time. And those two big roads cross just near Stratford-upon-Avon. They cross near Warwick. They cross right in the East Midlands. And as a result, the East Midlands are the crossroads of the English Civil War. The First English Civil War hinges on the East Midlands.
In the last week of October, the beginning of the last week of October, 1642, we have a very unusual situation. We have the Royalist army sitting on the lines of communication of the Parliamentary army. The Parliamentary army finding that its route back to London was blocked by the Royalist army. Now, at about 3 o'clock in the morning of Sunday, the 23rd of October, the Royalist army received information that the Parliamentary army was preparing to advance southeast back towards London. The king had to find a good blocking position, and there is an obvious one to the northwest of Banbury. And this is the ridge at Edgehill. It's a 300-foot escarpment. If he could get there before the Parliamentary army, then he could prevent their return to London.
The Royalist army formed up on the steep slope of Edgehill, facing away from the village of Radway and overlooking the Parliamentary forces on the plain below. The first major battle of the English Civil War, a battle that many on both sides believed would decide the outcome of the war itself, was just hours away.
In 1642, when the First Civil War starts, nobody knows that this is year one of the 4-year First English Civil War. So nobody in England is prepared economically, politically, militarily to fight a long civil war.
The two sides at Edgehill were roughly equivalent. Both sides deployed about 14,000 men. Of these, the majority were infantry, about a total of 20,000 altogether, with about 2,500 cavalry on each side. But these were very raw troops. Although some of the officers, and indeed some of the personnel, had experience of war either against the Scots relatively recently or on the continent in the previous couple of decades, there were very few people at Edgehill who considered themselves expert soldiers. The standards of training, given that this was so early in the war and the troops were rawly raised, were very low. The quality of the weapons on both sides was not particularly sophisticated, and indeed some of the Royalist forces even took the field armed with nothing more than pitchforks, agricultural implements of various kinds, or even cudgels.
Infantry regiments of the period were made up of two quite different types of soldier. These were musketeers and pikemen. In action, the pikemen were grouped together in the centre of each battalion, forming a forest of pike shafts with a wing of musketeers on each side. Firearms were still evolving, and the musketeers were mainly armed with matchlock muskets. An experienced soldier could load and fire within 30 seconds, but there were few of these when the war began. The pikemen had once been the most important element of an infantry regiment and formed 2/3 of a regiment during Elizabeth I's reign. But by the time of the Civil War, they were in decline, eclipsed by the more versatile and deadly musketeers. Fewer and fewer of them now wore the armour shown in the elegantly illustrated drill books of the period, but they still had an important role to play, especially in using their long pikes to fend off enemy cavalrymen. They could also deliver a decisive blow by moving forward with their pikes levelled at the charge. For usually, the threat of coming to grips with the pike was enough to cause one side or the other to break and run.
If regiments retained their formations, the result could be a kind of a rugby scrum in which not too many people would get hurt. There are incidents in the battle where royalist and parliamentary regiments come to push of pike. Neither gives way, nothing happens, and so they both retreat 4 or 5 paces and just fire their muskets at one another. The musket is a devastating weapon in terms of individual injuries in this period. If a regiment broke, then it becomes formidable. Then you begin to see the butcher's bill of dead and wounded.
Cavalry were of 2 kinds: the heavy cuirassiers, clad in armour from head to toe like medieval knights, and light cavalrymen called harquebusiers, who wore only a breastplate or a heavy buff leather coat. The cuirassiers were intended to charge home, while the harquebusiers were skirmishers, trained to fight with firearms rather than up close with swords.
With some notable exceptions, the standard of unit cohesion and discipline of English Civil War cavalry was pretty low. It's worth bearing in mind that until 1642 there were almost no trained bodies of cavalry anywhere within the British Isles. So really these formations had to be formed from scratch.
On the parliamentary side, the cavalry is a weakness at this period, and this was diagnosed by one of the great cavalry commanders of the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell, who was not present at Edgehill, his troops were not sufficiently near to be brought into the battle, read Edgehill as a frightful comment on the parliamentary cavalry. He described them as decayed tapsters and serving men. They lacked the spirit of the royalist gentry.
I think it's true to say that the royalist cavalry on balance also had something of a predisposition towards indiscipline. It's worth bearing in mind that the social elevation of many of its members, squires, nobility even, and certainly gentlemen, made it difficult for them psychologically to adjust to the idea of being given orders, certainly by their social inferiors. So the royalist cavalry throughout the English Civil War showed something of a tendency to charge at full speed ahead against the enemy, but then proved very difficult to rally and to use really at any other point during the battle.
Artillery, though invaluable in sieges, seldom played a decisive role in pitched battles, since cannon were generally too heavy to move easily and too slow to reload. The cannon of the period fired cannonballs, smooth projectiles designed not to explode, but to cause horrific injury by the violence of their passage. Those unfortunate enough to find themselves in the path of a cannonball often had arms or legs torn off as the deadly missile passed through massed ranks of men. Although artillery was, without doubt, cumbersome and inefficient, no field army of the period was considered complete without at least a few guns.
The king, by leaving London, had abandoned the Tower of London, and that was traditionally where most of the artillery in England was kept. That meant that the king had to scrape together artillery in order to equip his army to move on London. And he was able to scrape together about 20 guns, not a lot of guns. Parliament held the Tower of London in 1642, therefore they had more guns. Had at least 30 at Edgehill, maybe more. Some people suggest he had almost 40 guns at Edgehill.
Unable to tempt the parliamentarians to attack their favourable positions on the hill, the king's men moved down onto the forward slope towards Kyneton. The king, seeming to sense the apprehension of men about to go into battle for the first time, rode to each regiment and brigade of horses in his army, encouraging them to their duty. These stirring words from the supposedly less than charismatic Charles certainly had the desired effect. Enormous cheers began to ring around the royalist army. It was probably these cheers that goaded the parliamentary artillery into firing the first shots of the battle. Curiously enough, the name of the very first casualty of the Battle of Edgehill is recorded. The unfortunate man was Lieutenant Francis Bowles of Fielding's regiment, who was struck down as he stood near the centre of the royalist line.
On the face of it, one would have assumed that the royalist gunners would have had the advantage. They, after all, were on ground which is slightly higher than the parliamentary ground. But what tended to happen is that their balls, their cannonballs, actually ploughed into furrowed fields. When the parliamentary guns fired, their cannonballs actually ricocheted, and they carried on up the hill. And in some cases, they penetrated right through the royalist lines and almost reached the royalist gun line.
It was now time for the royalist cavalry to make its first move. The cavalry was under the command of Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's dashing and energetic nephew. As the king was to find to his cost, the young prince was also more than a little impetuous.
He doesn't take orders easily. He likes to be in charge of his own cavalry, and at Edgehill there is a conflict over the organisation of the Royalist army, in which Rupert plays a role. Rather than taking orders from his general, he supports an alternative formation for the Royalist army initially, and the Earl of Lindsey, the Royalist commander-in-chief, sulks in consequence of that. But this is not untypical of Rupert. He likes to have his own way of doing things. He doesn't take orders. He is a prince of the blood, after all. In terms, of course, of his cavalry, he never, I think, sufficiently disciplines them.
In effect, what it meant was that the cavalry were not part of the battle plan. It meant that the cavalry operated independently of the infantry and the artillery, and there was none of the synergy that might have been gained if they'd been used differently.
The royalist horses, 3 deep, began to move forward towards Sir James Ramsay's parliamentary cavalry on the left wing, expecting to meet it in a huge hand-to-hand battle. That fight, however, never happened, for as the charging royalists drew close, the parliamentarians lost their nerve and fled the field without ever coming to grips with their enemy.
The initial charge of the royalist cavalry puts to flight the parliamentary cavalry. Parliamentary cavalry had been expecting a kind of a carousel that the royalists would actually ride up to within pistol shot and then open fire and then withdraw to reload their pistols. They weren't expecting this massive cavalry riding knee to knee to come lunging at them. This was Rupert's contribution to the cavalry. And of course, when they see this coming, they turn and they run.
Their task was not made any easier when Sir Faithful Fortescue and his men changed sides and began to attack their erstwhile comrades, although it's doubtful whether even this made much difference. The die was cast, and the panic-stricken mob was pursued off the field for 7 miles towards Kyneton. The jubilant royalist cavalry believed they had already won the day. Only the regiment of foot of Denzil Hollis was able to offer any kind of resistance to the rampant royalist cavalry on the parliamentary left wing. Despite the exhortations of Prince Rupert, the royalist horses swept on towards Kyneton, where they found the carts and wagons of Essex's army. Here there was a host of prizes to plunder, among them the coach of Essex himself. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, there were more troubles for the parliamentary side, as Lord Wilmot, on the royalist left wing, easily swept Lord Fielding's cavalry from the field. The foot regiment of Sir William Fairfax also broke and ran, none faster or with more purpose than Lieutenant Thomas Whitney, who found a horse and didn't stop riding until he reached London. Here too, though, the triumphant royalists lost their discipline and made their way off the field, away from the main fighting, towards Kyneton.
When the royalist cavalry on both wings of the Edgehill battlefield essentially disappeared from the battlefield, heading off in the direction of Kyneton to wipe out the fleeing parliamentarian foot and cavalry, really the chances of the royalists winning a decisive victory began to evaporate. Although something like 10,000 royalist foot remained on the battlefield, they were still up against 6,000 or 7,000 parliamentarian foot, many of whom were reasonably well motivated and determined to fight, but more importantly, they were also up against a small but capable parliamentarian cavalry reserve. And as the battle developed and that parliamentarian reserve was committed into the battle, the royalists had nothing equivalent that they could throw at the parliamentarians.
If the royalist cavalry, if even one wing of the royalist cavalry, Rupert on the right, or the left wing of the cavalry, had behaved as Cromwell's cavalry behaved at Marston Moor or Naseby, there would have been a total victory for the royalists. The parliamentary infantry would have found themselves engaged in the front by royalist infantry, approximately equal in number to them, and then, as the royalists found themselves, attacked from the flank and the rear by cavalry, they would almost certainly have broken under that kind of pressure.
The hour had now come for the royalist foot to make its move and to follow up the successes of the cavalry. Sir Jacob Astley, at the head of the royalist troops, knelt and made one of English history's most famous prayers.
O Lord, thou knowest how busy I must be this day. If I forget thee, do not thou forget me.
With that, Astley rose to his feet and crying,
March on, boys.
He led forward the royalist foot. They marched forward resolutely at a slow but steady pace. Many among the royalist ranks would have seen and been greatly encouraged by the successes won by the cavalry, and their confidence was surely reinforced when the parliamentarian brigade of Charles Essex simply crumbled away without ever striking a blow.
At this point, the royalists should have begun the annihilation of a parliamentary army. Things seem to be falling to pieces very rapidly indeed. But the parliamentary infantry, most of it, did not lose its head. The reserve regiment marches up. It filters into the line to replace the soldiers who fled, Essex's soldiers. And the royalist pikes meet a solid wall of parliamentary pikes. And they actually come to push a pike. And the battle sways backwards and forwards for some minutes.
The royalist Clarendon, in the thick of the fighting, later described the dreadful melee in the centre of the Royalist line.
The foot of both sides stood their ground with great courage. They kept their ranks. The execution was great on both sides, but much greater on the Earl of Essex's party.
Pikemen on both sides are both armed with similar weapons. Neither side is going to expose themselves to death and mutilation to get the other side with their own pike points. So by nature, when two groups of pike came together, they did not aggressively massacre each other. They conservatively attempted to push each other around. Meanwhile, the muskets could fire at the pikemen. They could actually kill pikemen. So what you want to do in close combat is you want to take your pikes, use them to protect your own muskets, while your muskets do the killing, and while your artillery does the killing.
In this environment, it's very difficult to know what's actually going on at any distance from yourself. All you see around yourself is your comrades, or perhaps if you're standing in the first couple of ranks, your enemies. You really are standing chest to chest and shoulder to shoulder with your friends and with your opponents. So this would have been close quarter bludgeoning, jabbing, slashing, extremely unpleasant. Of course, the musketeers, of which there were roughly equivalent numbers to the pikemen at Edgehill, on some occasions would be able to reload their weapons and fire them at very close range, and the wounds that these large caliber weapons would have caused would have been extremely unpleasant and in many cases, of course, fatal.
Perhaps the best commentaries on what close quarters combat was like come from the various chaplains on the Royalist and the parliamentary side, and they are appalled by what they see, by the bestiality of men clubbing one another and shooting gigantic holes with these vast musket bullets into one another.
The 7 remaining parliamentary regiments were now engaged in mortal combat with 10,000 Royalist foot soldiers. Despite the early signs, however, the Royalist advance was gradually faltering as the hedgehogs of pikemen, flanked by supporting musketeers, struggled to push the parliamentarians back or to break through their lines. The gaps in the parliamentary ranks created by the defeat of Charles Essex's brigade were filled by the brigade of Thomas Ballard, and the parliamentarians were now definitely turning the tide of battle. It was now the turn of the few parliamentarian cavalrymen who had not fled the field to play a crucial role in the day's fighting.
In that infantry battle, things are pretty much of a muchness, almost a standoff. But Balfour has held back some of his cavalry regiments, and these cavalry regiments then assail the Royalist infantry regiments on the left flank. And those Royalist infantry regiments, 2 of the Royalist infantry regiments, fighting hand to hand in front, suddenly find themselves assailed on the flank.
The credit for the decisive action goes to Lieutenant General Sir William Balfour. Balfour, along with Sir Philip Stapleton, gathered up the few available horsemen and launched a furious assault upon the Royalist foot brigades led by Colonel Richard Fielding and Sir Nicholas Byron. Balfour routed Fielding's brigade, who, in the face of the onslaught, threw down their weapons and ran away. From his position, King Charles could now see the royalist centre in full retreat, streaming back towards the hill with the parliamentarians hot on their heels, mercilessly cutting down the fleeing fugitives. Meanwhile, the King's lifeguard was locked in combat with Constable's regiment, and it was here that one of the battle's most dramatic episodes occurred. Sir Edmund Verney, the Knight Marshal who bore the King's banner royal, was cut down as he defended the standard in the swirling melee. A reluctant soldier, Verney had rallied to the King's cause not in support of strongly held beliefs, but out of a sense of gratitude for the honours bestowed upon him by his monarch. Now he was dead, killed by Ensign Arthur Young, who snatched the royal standard from his lifeless hand. The parliamentarian triumph was short-lived, however. The royalist, Captain Smith, galloped up to retrieve the flag, crying,
"Traitor, deliver the standard!"
as he scattered the parliamentarian troops. Although he was badly wounded in the process, the heroic Smith returned the standard to the King's side. It had remained in parliamentarian hands for just 6 minutes. Fortunately for the King, the royalist centre was strong enough to prevent a complete collapse.
The royalist infantry regiments themselves show their morale and discipline. Supported by cannon, the remainder of the royalist infantry managed to hold out despite the presence of cavalry. They're aware by now that cavalry is going to come against them, and they prepare themselves for that. And finally, the battle becomes more a standoff, and then the royalist cavalry return from their chase.
What their feelings were as they watched the royalist cavalry return to the field after its trip to Kyneton can only be guessed. The King's cavalry had been absent from the field for virtually the entire battle. Thinking they had played their part and won the day, they had busied themselves plundering the parliamentarian baggage train, while their comrades in the foot regiments were fighting a life-or-death struggle.
Although it's very easy and perhaps tempting to blame Prince Rupert for the failure of the royalist cavalry at Edgehill to play a more decisive role in the battle, this might perhaps be a little bit unfair. Certainly it's true to say that Prince Rupert, as overall commander of the royalist cavalry, had a clear responsibility to make sure that their actions were carefully coordinated and fulfilled the commander's higher intent. Having said this, it also seems to be the case that some of Prince Rupert's subordinates failed to behave themselves properly, if you like. Certainly the second line royalist cavalry failed, I think, to really do what they should have done at Edgehill. When the first waves or the first line of the royalist cavalry dashed forward and routed their opponents on both wings, it would have been far more effective had the second line of royalist cavalry waited, and then they would have been available to attack the parliamentarian infantry in the centre. Instead, on both wings, really it would seem on the volition of their commanders, certainly on the right, under Digby, the royalist cavalry simply dashed forward to pursue the already routed opponents from the field.
They eventually returned to the field of battle, mainly because they'd encountered fresh parliamentarian regiments at Kyneton. But their belated return was of no help to the royalist foot. Where were they when Balfour's cavalry had made its charge and saved the day for Parliament?
The return of the royalist cavalry allowed the royalist right flank to be stabilised, because this was the area that looked as though it was going to be knocked in by parliamentary attacks.
By the time that the royalists were able to dribble some of their cavalry back into the main scene of action at Edgehill, really the moment of decision had passed. The horses that were returning were exhausted. The units that were returning had no cohesion whatsoever. We're talking about small numbers or even individuals, rather than proper formed units returning to the field of battle.
The battle is already becoming something of a stalemate, and the return of the Royalist cavalry gives the parliamentarians every reason not to continue their attack. Perhaps again a more aggressive general than Essex, better in command of the whole range of his troops, might have seen that in fact the Royalist cavalry didn't represent a serious threat, but they look pretty threatening, and in consequence the two sides slowly disengage.
Darkness fell early on this late autumn day, and the failing light came as a relief to the two exhausted, bleeding armies. When the fighting ended, they settled down to endure a freezing night, which added to the miseries of the men and served to further confuse an already muddled situation. The fact was that, for all the ferocious fighting, neither side had won the day. There had been terrible loss of life. Some estimates put the dead at 1,500 on either side.
Edgehill is an unusual battle in that the ratio of dead to wounded after the battle was almost equal. It's about 3,000 dead on the battlefield and about 3,000 wounded. And the reason that so many of the wounded had actually survived was that during the night there had been a cold snap, there had been some degrees of frost on the ground. And this, of course, had staunched the flow of blood. The blood had congealed, and so men who, under normal circumstances, would have died during the night were still alive the following morning.
The principal reason that the Royalists had not won victory was the performance of Prince Rupert's cavalry. Had they kept their discipline and returned to the field, the Royalists would almost certainly have won the day. As it was, their shambolic pursuit of the parliamentarians and pointless raid upon the baggage train cost their side dear. With no cavalry to influence the fighting, the dogged parliamentarians managed to hold the Royalists to a draw, albeit at a fearful price.
Like many of the battles of the English Civil War, Edgehill was a confused and relatively unsophisticated affair. Certainly with troops of the kind that both sides had at Edgehill, and with the weapons that they had, this was hardly surprising. The leadership was not good, the troops were untrained and undrilled for the most part, and anything other than confusion would have been exceptional, certainly extremely surprising. Indeed, it's also true to say that both sides had real opportunities to gain decisive victory, but again, with the lack of sophistication and the rather dubious quality of many of the commanders, and indeed the tensions within the command headquarters, if you like, on both sides, the fact that none of these opportunities were actually effectively exploited shouldn't come as any real surprise.
In a sense, there are, three battles at Edgehill. The initial total victory of the Royalist cavalry, the parliamentary infantry supported by cavalry, winning must have looked like themselves an easy victory, and then the standoff.
The battle that some believed would finish the war had proved to be merely the beginning of a conflict that, for the next 4 years, would tear the country apart.
The Battle of Edgehill lasted just 4 hours. And it was the first major clash of the English Civil War. And up until that time, it had been a political crisis. After Edgehill, it's going to be no holds barred. The king actually offers Essex a pardon, and his parliamentary army a pardon after the battle. Essex refuses and says, no, we really won Edgehill.
Both sides were caught up in the classical idea of victory. You look out at the battlefield and you see that one person has won and the other one has lost. So is Edgehill a decisive battle? It is not. It is an indecisive battle. It is a battle that does not win the war for either side. Does that mean it's not important? No. Because what's important about the Battle of Edgehill is that it is the first sign that comes to either side that says this war will not be short. This is not going to be won in one battle. Edgehill is the first intimation to both sides that this is not some war out of a book. This is modern war. This is the beginning of modern war. And they're in the middle of it, and it's going to go on for a good long time.
What Edgehill proved was that there were sufficient numbers of people, both commanders and indeed ordinary men, ordinary soldiers, who were willing to kill their fellow citizens in order to change or maintain the political system within England. And this was really very important. As a statement of intent, Edgehill's significance was indeed great.
After the bitterly cold night had passed, Essex abandoned the battlefield to the king and withdrew northwards to the safety of Warwick Castle, leaving the way clear for the king to march on London. The impetuous Rupert was all for making a dash with his cavalry to occupy the city before Essex could march there with the battered remains of his army. Not for the last time, the king prevaricated in the hope that a peaceful settlement could be reached, and the greatest opportunity of the war to capture the parliamentary stronghold was lost.
Some historians have suggested that the advantage lay with Charles if he had been prepared to take it, if he had not been worried about that we should be negotiating at this juncture. I think the truth of this matter is that Charles was in no position to press on to London. His troops had been badly mauled at Edgehill. He needed time to recuperate. A cavalry raid on London, which is what Rupert was proposing, would have been pretty useless. The problem for the king, in a sense, is always the strength of London.
The parliamentarians who mustered at Turnham Green to defend London were too strong for the exhausted royalist army to meet in battle, and the king, reluctantly, withdrew to Oxford for the winter, there to establish his court. For the next 4 years, the university city would be the royalist capital. King Charles was never to reach London except as a prisoner of his enemies and to await his execution.